Imagine you're on top of the world, living your best life. Suddenly, everything you know and love is taken from you. What would you do? Today, we're exploring one of the Bible's most incredible stories, the story of Job, a man who faced the hardest test of faith ever recorded. Could you keep trusting God if you lost everything? Let's dive into this amazing journey of courage, patience, and faith. Who was Job, a man known for his faith and kindness? Job was a man who lived long, long ago in a place called Uz. Imagine someone everyone in town knew and admired, not just because he was rich, but because he was kind, generous, and always tried to do what was right. Job had it all. He had a big, happy family with 7 sons and 3 daughters who loved each other, and they often gathered for family feasts filled with laughter, stories, and love. Job also owned thousands of animals: sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys, more than anyone else around. People saw Job as someone blessed by God in every way, and they admired him not just for what he had, but for the way he lived. Job's kindness, honesty, and devotion to God made him truly special. But here's the twist. Life isn't always easy, even for someone as faithful as Job. What would happen if all that Job had was taken from him? How strong would his faith be then? Job's life was about to change in ways he could never imagine. You're about to hear a story full of heart-stopping moments, surprising tests, and an unbreakable spirit that even angels in heaven were watching. Are you ready to follow Job on this incredible adventure and see just how strong faith can be, even when everything seems lost? Buckle up, because this is where the story truly begins. A challenge in heaven. A test of faith begins. One day, up in the heavens where only angels and God dwell, a surprising conversation began. A conversation about Job. God was proud of Job, knowing that Job's faith was strong and that he lived his life in a way that pleased God. But then Satan appeared with a very different opinion. With a sly grin, Satan challenged God, saying, "Of course Job trusts you. Look at all he has, his family, his wealth, his health. You've given him everything he could ever want. But take it all away, and I bet he'll curse you to your face." Imagine that. Satan was saying Job's love for God wasn't real, that it was only because his life was easy. Now, God knew Job's heart, but to show everyone, including the angels, that Job's faith was real, God allowed Satan to test him. However, God gave one important rule. You can take away what Job has, but you cannot hurt him. And just like that, a powerful and invisible challenge began, a challenge Job knew nothing about. Suddenly, without warning, his life would take a shocking turn. Can you imagine if, in just one day, everything you loved, every person you cared for, and everything you owned were suddenly gone? How would you feel? Would you still trust God? Job's test was about to start, and it would push him to his very limits. This wasn't just any test. It was a test of true faith that even the angels watched with bated breath. Hold on tight. Job's journey is about to get intense, and every twist will leave you wondering, what would I do if I were Job? Disaster strikes. Job loses his wealth and family. Hold on tight, because here comes the part where everything changes for Job in just one single day. Imagine waking up to find that all your favorite toys, games, and even your pet have vanished overnight. Sounds scary, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to Job, but on a much bigger scale. First, messengers came rushing to Job with terrible news. They said Job's animals, his sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys have been stolen or killed by marauding thieves. Job's heart sank as he realized his hard-earned livestock, which brought him wealth and respect, were all gone. But that was just the beginning. Then more messengers arrived, bringing even worse news. Job's servants have been attacked and killed by enemies. They shouted. Job's heart broke a little more each time he heard the devastating news. His once bustling home, filled with laughter and joy, was now filled with silence and sorrow. But the most heartbreaking moment came when the messengers delivered the worst news of all. Job's beloved children were playing together when a sudden, terrible accident happened. They didn't survive. Job felt like his world was crumbling around him. All the love, the family gatherings, the happy moments, they were all gone in an instant. Can you imagine how Job felt? His whole life, which was full of blessings and happiness, was taken away in one terrifying day. But here's the incredible part. Despite all this unimaginable loss and heartbreak, Job didn't turn away from God. Instead, he fell to the ground, overwhelmed with grief, and said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." The second test. Job's health was taken away. Satan wasn't finished with Job, not by a long shot. After Job had lost everything he owned, his family, his wealth, his friends, Satan came back to challenge him with an even harsher test. This time, he aimed right at Job himself. In a single day, Job's body was covered in painful, ugly sores from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. Imagine itching and hurting all over, with no relief. No way to sleep or sit comfortably. Job was so miserable, he found himself sitting in a pile of ashes, picking up a broken piece of pottery to scrape his skin, trying anything to ease the pain. Imagine the sadness and loneliness Job felt, sitting there, hurting, with no one to help him. Even his wife, who had also lost everything, looked at him and said, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" Can you imagine hearing those words from someone you love? She'd lost hope, and maybe she couldn't bear to see Job suffer any longer. She thought giving up was the only way. But Job, despite everything, looked back at her and said something powerful. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Job wasn't saying that he liked being in pain or that he didn't miss his family. He was saying that he trusted God, even when things seemed impossible. Can you imagine that level of faith? Job was in agony, feeling the worst pain of his life. But even when he was hurting and everything seemed lost, he still trusted God. How do you think you would react in such a situation? Job's strength and trust in God, even in the hardest moment, remind us that true faith doesn't just show up in the good times. Sometimes it shines the brightest when things seem darkest. Job's friends arrive, a visit that turned sour. After Job had been sitting in his misery for what felt like forever, 3 of his closest friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, finally came to visit him. They had heard about the disaster that had struck Job, and they set off to comfort him, hoping to ease his pain. For a while they sat with him in silence, sharing his sorrow and feeling his heartbreak. They didn't say a word. Just being there with him in his suffering was their way of showing support. But then, as days passed and the silence grew heavy, something unexpected happened. Instead of offering comfort, they began to question Job. They looked at him and said, "Job, you have to admit, God is just, and if you're suffering, there must be something you did wrong. Maybe you've sinned, or maybe you haven't been faithful enough." Their words cut deep. Instead of lifting Job up, they began to blame him, accusing him of bringing this pain upon himself. Can you imagine how Job must have felt? His heart was already broken. His body was in agony, and now his friends, the people who should have been comforting him, were telling him that it was his fault. Job had done nothing wrong, but no one seemed to believe him. Job's questions, wrestling with doubts and pain. As the days dragged on, Job's suffering grew more intense, each hour stretching into what felt like an eternity. The pain in his body was excruciating, but it was his heart, broken and bruised, that truly ached. Job had lost everything: his wealth, his family, his health, and in the midst of all this, his soul seemed to crack. His pain wasn't just a physical wound, it was something much deeper, a spiritual fracture that cut through his very being. Every question he asked seemed to echo louder than the last, each one reverberating through the emptiness of his heart. Why am I suffering? Job's voice quivered with desperation. What have I done to deserve this? These questions, once mere whispers, began to roar within him, relentlessly wearing down whatever strength he had left. Each day, another question, another stone in his path. His mind, once clear and sharp, was clouded with confusion. Job was searching for answers, but they slipped away, like sand through his fingers. It didn't make sense. He had lived a good life, a life rooted in integrity, generosity, and deep faith in God. He had always believed that if you followed God's ways, life would go well. So, why now? Why this? Why had everything that he had worked so hard for, everything that had been a gift from God, been taken away? Job's life had once been a testimony of blessing and favor. He had been the epitome of righteousness, known for his fairness, his commitment to justice, and his care for the needy. He had honored God with his actions, lived generously, and treated others with kindness. But now, everything was gone. His wealth had evaporated, his children were dead, and his body was ravaged by disease. In his moments of deepest agony, Job couldn't help but question why God had allowed all of this to happen to him. His world had been shaken to its core, and he felt as though the very foundation of his existence was crumbling beneath his feet. "Why is this happening?" Job cried out, his voice thick with sorrow. "Why me? Why now? What did I do to deserve this?" It was a question many of us ask when life doesn't seem fair. We all face moments when we feel abandoned by the world, moments when we question why we must endure such heartache. Job's story speaks to that universal human experience, the painful wrestling with doubt, confusion, and the search for meaning in the midst of suffering. When everything is stripped away, we are left with the most basic and important question: why? Perhaps you've faced your own moments of questioning. Maybe you've been hit with a loss that took your breath away, or a trial that tested every ounce of your patience and strength. Maybe you've asked, why me? Or, why now? When life feels upside down, it's easy to feel lost, as if the world around you doesn't make sense anymore. And like Job, we often search for the reasons behind our pain. It's natural to want to know why bad things happen to good people, and to struggle with the tension between the goodness of God and the suffering we face. But here's the surprising part of Job's story. Despite his desperate questions, despite the overwhelming confusion, Job never turned away from God. His cries of anguish weren't directed at the void. They were aimed squarely at the one who had allowed this pain to enter his life. Job, in his grief, didn't shut God out. He cried out to God. His suffering led him to a raw and honest place where his pain, confusion, and frustration could be laid bare before the Creator. In the midst of his questions, Job kept reaching for God. His faith wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a faith that allowed him to bring his doubts, his anger, and his sorrow into the presence of God. Job's questions were big, really big, but they were the questions that often surface in moments of suffering. These are the questions that many of us wrestle with when we face hardship. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God allow such pain in the lives of those who try to live right? Job's story teaches us that it's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to bring our doubts and struggles to God. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting in God, even when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are. Job's willingness to ask these tough questions, his openness with God in the midst of suffering, reminds us that God welcomes our honest hearts. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to have it all figured out. God knows we are human. He knows our hearts. And He invites us to bring our whole selves to Him. He doesn't expect us to pretend we have all the answers, or that we don't feel pain. Job's story shows us that faith doesn't require us to be free from doubt. It's about continuing to trust in God, even when life doesn't make sense. In our own lives, we can learn from Job's example. It's okay to be honest with God about our pain, our doubts, and our questions. Sometimes, just being real with God, expressing our feelings and asking our hard questions, is a step toward healing. Job's cries weren't the end of his journey. They were the beginning of a deeper relationship with God. His willingness to seek God, even in his confusion, opened the door to a new phase of his journey, a phase where he would gain a deeper understanding of who God is, even in the midst of his suffering. So, when life brings you to your knees, when the weight of the world feels unbearable, remember Job. You can ask the hard questions, express your doubts, and still hold on to God. He is there, listening to every cry, every question, and every tear. You are not alone in your suffering. Even when it feels like the world is indifferent, God is near. He understands your pain, and He is with you in the midst of it. Have you ever been in a situation where you asked, why? Have you ever faced a challenge that made you feel completely lost and broken? Like Job, you can share those feelings with God. You can pour out your heart to Him, knowing that He sees you and cares deeply about your struggles. In those moments of pain, when the answers seem far away, trust that God is listening and that He is working in ways you cannot see. Elihu speaks a fresh perspective on suffering. As Job wrestled with his pain in the silence of God, something unexpected happened. A young man named Elihu, who had been quietly observing the conversations between Job and his friends, stood up to speak. Until now, the dialogue had been dominated by Job's friends, who had offered their own explanations for his suffering, accusations that Job was being punished for some hidden sin. But Elihu was different. He had watched in silence, waiting for the right moment to speak. Now, with a sense of urgency, he stepped forward and offered Job something new, a fresh perspective. Unlike the others, Elihu didn't accuse Job of wrongdoing. He didn't try to assign blame. Instead, he spoke with a wisdom that was both bold and compassionate. He acknowledged Job's pain and the depth of his suffering, but he also offered a new way of looking at the situation. Elihu's words were like a breath of fresh air in the midst of the suffocating despair Job had been feeling. He told Job, God's ways are higher than our ways, and sometimes suffering is a process, an opportunity for growth. This wasn't the kind of answer Job had been seeking, but it was a different kind of truth, one that Job hadn't considered. Elihu didn't dismiss Job's pain or belittle his suffering. He simply offered a new way of thinking about it. That suffering, while incredibly painful, could also serve a higher purpose. Sometimes, the difficulties we face are not a punishment. They are a part of a process that God uses to refine us, to shape us, and to make us stronger. This perspective was not about minimizing Job's pain, but about expanding his understanding of God's greater plan. For Job, Elihu's words were a turning point. After listening to his friends accuse him, and struggling to find answers on his own, here was someone offering a new perspective, one that helped Job see that his suffering might have a deeper purpose. Perhaps it wasn't just something to endure. It could be something that would draw him closer to God, something that would refine his character and deepen his faith. Job hadn't considered that his pain could be part of a larger process, something that could shape his future and bring him closer to the heart of God. Elihu's wisdom didn't offer all the answers, but it gave Job a new framework through which to view his suffering. It helped him understand that, even in the midst of his pain, there was a greater plan at work, a plan that God was unfolding in ways Job couldn't yet see. Elihu's words sparked something in Job, a renewed sense of hope. Even though the answers to his questions were still elusive, Job now saw that there was more to the story. His suffering wasn't meaningless. There was purpose in it. God was at work, even when Job couldn't understand why. Sometimes, all we need in our own struggles is a new perspective. We need to hear something different, a fresh outlook that helps us see beyond our immediate pain. Elihu's words helped Job shift his focus from his own suffering to the bigger picture of God's plan. Sometimes, we too need to be reminded that God is at work in our lives, even when we can't see it. Our pain is not in vain. It is part of a larger process, one that may eventually lead us to greater growth, greater understanding, and a deeper relationship with God. God speaks to Job. Questions from the whirlwind. Job pondered Elihu's words, and as he continued to search for answers, something extraordinary happened. Just when it seemed that his suffering couldn't get any worse, a mighty whirlwind began to roar. The winds howled, and the earth trembled beneath Job's feet, and from the heart of the whirlwind came a voice like thunder, a voice that shook Job to his core. It was the voice of God. Can you imagine the awe, the terror, and the wonder that Job must have felt in that moment? He had been questioning God, asking why his suffering had been allowed to unfold. But instead of answering his questions with simple explanations, God came to Job in a whirlwind and asked him a series of questions. The questions weren't about Job's suffering. They were about God's greatness and his power and his wisdom. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? God asked. Tell me if you understand. With each question, God revealed the immensity of his creation, the depth of his knowledge, and the vastness of his wisdom. Job had been so consumed with his own pain and confusion that he had lost sight of the bigger picture, the grandeur of God's creation, the greatness of his plan, and the vastness of his understanding. God's questions weren't meant to mock Job or to scold him for his doubts. They were meant to help Job see the bigger picture. Job had been asking, why me? Why now? But God was showing him that there was so much more to the world than his immediate suffering. There were mysteries beyond human understanding, things that only God could comprehend. Job had been focusing on his own pain, but God was inviting him to look at the world through a different lens, one that saw beyond the pain to the wonder of his creation and the greatness of his plan. In that moment, Job realized something profound. Even though he couldn't understand why he was suffering, he could trust that the creator of the universe, who had designed and sustained everything, was in control. Job had been so focused on his pain that he had forgotten the greatness of God's wisdom and power. But now, through God's questions, Job's perspective shifted. He saw that even though he couldn't see the full picture, God was still sovereign, and his plan was unfolding perfectly. Job's heart was humbled, and he began to see his suffering in a new light, not as meaningless, but as part of God's grand design. God restores Job a new beginning. After Job humbly accepted God's wisdom and acknowledged the limits of his understanding, something incredible happened. God restored everything Job had lost. His wealth was doubled, his health was renewed, and he was blessed with more children, children who would bring him joy and comfort. But the restoration was not just about getting back what he had lost. It was about the growth and transformation that had taken place within Job's heart. Through his trials, Job had developed a deeper understanding of God's character and a faith that was stronger than ever before. Job's restoration teaches us that, even in the midst of suffering, God's plans are good. Job's trials had refined him, shaping his character and deepening his relationship with God. When we face hardship, we may not always understand why, but we can trust that God is using the pain to shape us and to bring us closer to Him. Job didn't just regain what he had lost. He emerged from his trials with a newfound wisdom and a stronger faith. His story is a testimony to the power of holding on to God, even when everything else seems to be falling apart. The blessings Job received after his suffering were not just physical. They were spiritual, emotional, and relational. Job's relationship with God was deeper than it had ever been before, and his faith was unshakable. Job's story teaches lessons on faith and patience. His story, although ancient, speaks to us today. It speaks to the struggles we face, the doubts we wrestle with, and the pain we endure. Job reminds us that God sees our struggles and is with us, even when we can't feel it. Job's life shows us that faith is not just about receiving blessings, but about trusting God, even in the darkest of times. It's about holding on to faith when life doesn't make sense. Job teaches us patience, strength, and perseverance. He shows us that faith is not a fair-weather friend. It's there for us in our hardest moments, helping us endure when we don't have all the answers. Job's story invites us to trust in God's plan, even when we can't see the bigger picture. Why faith matters? Job's example of true strength is a powerful example of what true faith resembles. Job's faith wasn't rooted in his blessings. It was rooted in his trust in God's goodness. Even when everything was taken from him, Job continued to believe that God was good. His faith became the anchor that held him steady in the storm, and it carried him through the darkest days of his life. Faith, as Job demonstrates, is not about having it all figured out. It's about trusting God even when we don't understand why things are happening. It's about holding on when everything around us is falling apart. Job's life encourages us to build our own faith, remembering that God is faithful, even when we can't see it. His story inspires us to trust God no matter what, knowing that His plans are always for our good. Job's faith lasted through the good times and the bad, and his perseverance through suffering is a reminder that faith is not just about receiving blessings. It's about trusting God in every season of life. Conclusion: Job's story is a journey of faith and strength. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Job's life teaches us that faith is powerful, even in the hardest times. It's about trusting in God's plan, even when we don't have all the answers. If Job's story has encouraged you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others who may need a little hope and faith today. Remember, no matter what you're facing, God is with you, and He has a plan for every season of your life.